Hi everyone, this is Jerry. This is round 8 of the FIDE World Chess Championship 2010. Topalov with the white pieces in this game enters with 3 points against Anand's 4 and opens up with 1 d4. Anand replies d5, c4, c6. We've seen this opening before. It's the Slav Defense in rounds 3 and 5. We had identical moves all the way up until move 15, where at that point Anand with the black pieces was deviating. We have things fairly similar in this game up until this move here. For move 13 for black here, what was played in rounds 3 and 5 was a6, followed up with rook c1, rook g8, h4, and in round 3 h6 was played, and in round 5 h5 was played. We don't get to that point. Instead, we're seeing not a6 here, but instead rook c8. What's the difference? Well, the bishop's being hit. The other difference is that this square is no longer under control. The point of a6 in those other games was to watch over b5, so it really shouldn't come as a surprise that after rook c8, we're seeing white make use of this b5 square. So bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king. And only now pawn to a6, putting question to the bishop. Bishop takes knight. King takes bishop. What's going on here? White has just given up the bishop pair. As compensation, well, there's this black king who's potentially subjected to attack. He is on an open file, and there are still 2 rooks in play. So that's the compensation. The other form of compensation comes in the form of this bishop really not contributing to the position for as long as this pawn structure here is maintained. So these are the things that white is looking forward to in this sort of position. So from here, king e2, it's really unnecessary to castle. The idea is just to get this rook on d1. You're gonna want your king towards the center of the board since we are in an endgame. So pawn to f6 allows this bishop to move, so it doesn't have to watch over g7. Rook on h to d1. Discovered checks are in the air now with this bishop moving, so that's why we're seeing the king get off the file. King e8. a5, positional move. Just this one pawn alone is pretty much restraining both of these black pawns. There's also the idea of the knight hopping to a4, and from that square it has thoughts of both hopping to b6 or c5. Bishop e7. With ideas of maybe playing king f7, rook to d8, but that's out of the picture since this, because of this last move by white, the bishop controls this square, so now the black rooks can't make use of it, and now this rook has a clear view along this whole d file. Rook f8 with the idea of pushing forward here with the pawn. Rook on a to c1, so both rooks functioning on these 2 only open files. And now f5, so 2 things going on with this. Striking at e4 for what is now a second time, one directly, the other indirectly. Also, this bishop can now see along this diagonal. Pawn to e5, essentially trying to make this g6 bishop look ridiculous. For as long as this pawn remains here, this bishop isn't contributing to the position, so that's why we're seeing the avoidance of this pawn exchange. Bishop g5, the rook is being attacked, and now bishop back to e3 to defend. If we were to see this exchange occur, we'd enter an endgame here where it's a good knight versus a bad bishop. And the reason this bishop is considered bad is because it's on a light square, and so are all of its pawns for the most part, especially these pawns here. These pawns are fixed pawns, so you're going to want the order switched. If you have a light square bishop, generally speaking, you're going to want to have your pawns on dark squares if you're in this sort of an endgame. We don't see this exchange, but instead, after bishop e3, we're just seeing f4 attacking the bishop. And not the typical reply. This bishop does not get moved now, instead knight e4. If you're familiar with the adage that unprotected pieces leads to tactics, a move like this really shouldn't be too much of a surprise to you, because this bishop is unprotected and this rook is unprotected, and notice with white's last move both are now being attacked, so that can be a very forceful type of a move. There's no time to take this bishop because the rook on c8 is being attacked. What we are seeing from here is the exchange of rooks, and not the immediate recapture, but instead the in-between move, knight d6 with check. And only after king to d7 are we having bishop takes rook. Notice that it's the recapture with the bishop, since the bishop was being attacked by the pawn. And now there's the idea, or the thought, of moving this knight with another discovered check. So king c6 gets off the file and guards b7. Bishop d2 repositioning, allowing the rook to come here to give check. Bishop to e7, it makes sense to want to get rid of this guy on d6. He's very annoying, very deep in the black position, and for as long as it remains there, there's always possibilities of grabbing b7, so makes sense to want to get rid of him. Rook check, king d7, and we're seeing now bishop c3. If instead knight takes b, that'll just run into rook b8, and the rook will be able to swing down and become very active, grabbing the material back. We're not seeing that. Instead, bishop c3, a nice move. This bishop is really just gluing everything together of white's, watching over all of the pawns. Not that this a5 pawn would really need any support, but one of the features of having this bishop here is if the knight is taken, white could at some point recapture, and then this bishop is released in this direction. You could potentially see g7 following in some variations. So after bishop to c3 here, we're seeing the knight being captured, and yet again, not the immediate recapture, but instead just pinning the bishop to the king. This bishop will be won. White is trying to recapture it on more favorable terms. From here, bishop f5, there's really no saving this bishop, so bishop f5 with the intention of advancing this pawn, g5, h5. Moves like this you could potentially see with ideas of just exchanging more and more pawns. We are going to be arriving in a position where we have opposite color bishops, so black is just trying to exchange more pawns. Pawn to h4. Why not capture here right away? Well, one good question to maybe be asking yourself throughout the course of a game is, if I were to take this bishop and my opponent, let's say, goes here, or maybe king c8, what would be my next move? What would be my follow-up move? It's often the case that you first make that follow-up move first. There's really no hurry in grabbing this bishop right away. I mean, there could maybe even be a strategy in some instances where you just pile up on the piece, maybe this bishop b4 move, hitting the bishop for a third time. So it's often the case that the threat is more dangerous than the execution. So bishop f5, h4, g6, and only now does the bishop get captured, and now king c8, keeping the king on a light square. Your opponent has a dark square bishop. Bishop d2, pressure on f4, and now rook to d8. This pawn will fall, and we're going to arrive at an ending here where it's just opposite color bishops, with black being down a pawn. From here, bishop takes pawn. One other alternative, I'd be interested to see how things would pan out if after bishop takes pawn, h5 were played. The rooks were captured in this position, but I'd be interested to see how things would turn out if h5 was played, where the idea is just to kind of lock down on this g4 square. But we're not seeing that. Instead, after bishop takes pawn, the rooks are exchanged, and white has this pass pawn. Close eyes, definitely going to have to be watched over that pawn. It's just a couple squares away from queening. In the meantime, what gets done is the following. For white is just trying to make use of these dark squares, since none of them are controlled by any of the black pawns. All of these pawns are on light squares. The opponent, or black's bishop, is on a light square, so there's no dark squares being controlled by these highlighted pieces. So it's gonna be the black king who's going to be responsible for watching over the dark squares. King d7, king e3, bishop c2, king d4. Notice how the white king is just traveling along these dark squares, threatening to get to f6. That can't be allowed. You really don't want your opponent to get too deep into your own position with their king. King f7 watches over e6 and f6. Bishop e3, bishop a4, king f4, King f4 was just looking to go in either direction. Bishop c5. In summary, this move is now making this dark square bishop, or making black's bishop, stay on this diagonal. For if it leaves, we just push, and this pawn will queen since both of these squares are now covered. So that's what this bishop c5 move is doing. It's tying down this bishop to this diagonal. King f6, and well, this bishop is going to have to just give check. Otherwise, there's no way to make progress. You can't have this king here. King back, and now king g5. From here, we have bishop c6, king h6, and now we're in a position where white is putting pressure on this h7 pawn, and black is going to have to be watching over it. So you might be thinking, well, why even allow this sort of thing to come about? Why not, if you're seeing that this pawn is going to be, if this pawn here is going to have pressure against it, why not just maybe advance it to h5? Well, that won't work, and for the following reasons. g4 would then be played, where a question is now put to h5. Or in other words, this pawn really can't be maintained. There's two attackers on it. You really can't defend it again. So you have to give yourself up. Takes, and I'll just be making some back and forth moves with this bishop because there's really nothing else that black can do in this position but move back and forth. So in the meantime, white could be making progress in the following way, creating a passed pawn. We have an h pawn and a d pawn. These pawns just advance, and now there's three threats once we arrive at this position, and this position could come about by force if this h5 move were played. What would be going on from this position are the following things. There's three threats that white has: h7, d7, and the other threat is to just be placing the king on f6, for if it can get to that square, then that will translate into a win. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. If bishop d3 watching over this pawn, that would then be met with bishop c5, renewing the threat of pushing this pawn forward. If this bishop goes back here to stop this pawn's advance, we'd see h7, king g6, h8 queen, king here, and now king could come to f6. And from f6, it's then going to e7. From e7, it's supporting this advance. That will translate into a win. If instead of this bishop to b5 move, we see king here, well, that'll run into king f6, king g7, and from there, this pawn will be able to queen. That would translate into a win as well. So, in summary, from this position here, that's why we're not seeing pawn to h5, but instead bishop c6, king h6, king g8, and now h5, putting a question to this pawn. Bishop back to defend, king g5, king f7, king h6, king g8. We have the position repeating just a little bit, but only now are we seeing things slightly different. King or bishop c5. Again, this bishop is now devoted to this diagonal. Pawn takes pawn, and now king to g5. There really isn't much more that black can do from this position. Eventually this capture is going to have to occur. If instead we saw a move like, well, bishop here is no good because, again, just this. Again, the bishop is going to have to stay here. So if this bishop moves to any of these three squares, or any of these four squares, this pawn is just lost. So the other try is to just move the king to, let's say, here. Well, that would run into king takes pawn, so that wouldn't be good. If the king goes here, here's a variation: king e3, king g8, and now bishop to d4, putting black in zugzwang, placing black in a position where, regardless of what move would then be played, the position is going to worsen. So from here, black would then have to be taking on h5. So by force, white would eventually be forcing black to capture in this way, whether it's right now or a little bit later. One other quick point to make is that from this position right here, if black is to try this type of variation, king f7, just giving up h7, this is how things would turn out. Pawn takes pawn, king h6, h4, king g5, h3, takes, and eventually we're going to arrive at a position very similar to the one I already showed you, where there's this h pawn, eventually it'll get to h6, and then there will be from that point those three threats. The threats being to advance to h7, d7, and also to make use of this f6 square. So a similar approach would be taken from this variation as well. We aren't seeing that. Instead, what we did see was g5, king h6, king g8, h5, bishop e8, the repetition of moves, and now pawn takes pawn, king g5, threatening to get to f6, king g6, bishop check, king f7, and not taking this pawn right away. If you take the pawn right away, this move could come about where if the pawn's taken, king here, discover check, the king grabs the bishop. So a patient move. There's no need to go ahead and grab this pawn right away. Bishop to e5, not even allowing this pawn to advance. It's often the case that maybe this pawn could even work against black. You know, maybe black in some variations would want to just give this pawn up so that the king could make use of this square. So just bishop to e5 here. If this pawn is going to fall, well, this pawn is going to fall. If black wants to hang on to it with a move like this, again, the king just sneaks here, and that will produce a win. So if black is going to give up this pawn, they want to give it up and have the white king be in a less optimal position. So that's why we're seeing h4. If the pawn's going to be grabbed, the king's going to have to retreat. So that's what we're seeing. King takes pawn, king g6. A very strong position for the black king, in my opinion, and the reason I'm saying that is because from here it's really just boxing out the white king. From here, king g4, bishop b5, king f4, and king f7. This move I don't understand. I don't understand why you allow the king to make progress that easily. I really can't explain why this move was played. I'd be more inclined to just be kind of shuffling my bishop back and forth along this diagonal. Oh, not that diagonal. Along this diagonal here. I'm not really sure why king f7 was played, but it was in the game. And what we saw is follow-up moves were king g5, bishop back, king h6, king g8, and after pawn to g4, black resigns. And we have this series tied at 4 points apiece. What would occur from here, this is a one position for white, what would occur is the following. I'll just be making some moves back and forth with black because there's nothing more that could really be done. Bishop here. Here's a key move, bishop to g7, guarding f8. It's very important for the bishop to be doing that, and we'll see why very shortly. Bishop c6, g6, pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn. This king is in stalemate. The king can't move, but fortunately there are other moves that black could be making. Bishop here, king f6. Notice how this king, as a result of this pawn advance, this king was able to creep over to this f6 square, which is translating into a win. The other important feature is that from g7, since this bishop is guarding f8, the king can't make use of that square. If the king was able to make use of that square, he could then get to e8. And if he could get to e8, he could get to d7. And if he could get to d7, that would be a draw. So we have a little domino effect thing going on here. You can't allow the king to get to f8. So for as long as you're able to do that, this will be a win for white. And sure enough, it is. Because after, let's say, bishop b5, king f6, bishop c6, we just move the bishop back so that our king could come here freely, so that the king isn't having to watch over the bishop. If let's just say king here, the bishop just scoots out of the way. King here, pawn advanced. This will be a win. So one last thing, or actually a couple other things, is that from this position, I don't really see how white makes progress for as long as this king remains here. 12 moves were spent on this move, king f7, and just a handful of moves later, black ends up resigning. So it seems like there's a more, like maybe a better try that black could have had here. I'm not sure how progress is made. If you have suggestions, feel free to fire them my way. I really don't see it. I just see this king staying here. If white is trying to maybe get to this square and creep around in this direction, Here's just a quick hypothetical. If king here, if something like this occurs, I think the king, this is another drawn position. This king is now blockading this pawn. This bishop is guarding here, and for as long as this bishop remains on this diagonal, these two pawns can't move. You may be thinking, well, what if these pawns first move and then this sort of white king advance to this b6 square were to come about? I'm not quite sure how things would play out from there. Let's see if instead, after bishop b5, king f4, instead of king f7, let's just say g4 was played, or bishop here g4, and then just, I'll make progress with white, and in the meantime there's really not much that black can be doing. Maybe something like this. I'm really not seeing how things would really play out. I could potentially be seeing another passed pawn for white with something like this. I could see two potential passed pawns, but at the same time this is now a passed pawn, so there's potentially a blockade that could be coming about in this manner. If bishop here, king f4, king here, I'm really just not seeing how progress is made in this sort of ending, and in summary, I'm just really putting a big question to why from this position here king to f7 was played. It just seems as though you maintain your king here unless you're really forced to have to retreat. Again, if you have suggestions, feel free to fire them my way, but as it went in this game, in round 8, this right here was the final position. After pawn to g4, black ends up resigning, and again this series now in a dead heat, 4 points apiece. It's very exciting stuff. So hopefully, as always, you got something out of this game. Take care. Bye.